The purpose of the Blitz City DIY channel is to inspire fellow travelers who may not have come by electronics in a traditional way, and to provide a safe and open space for everyone. Tech is not neutral, especially now, and resources are always in the description to support communities and actions for positive change. There's a new Raspberry Pi single board computer, specifically a new version of the Raspberry Pi Zero, the Raspberry Pi Zero 2. Now, I would have maybe called it the Raspberry Pi Zero Strikes Back, maybe Raspberry Pi Zero to Hero, but you know, that's not my area of expertise, naming things, so I guess I'll trust their judgment. Raspberry Pi Zero 2 was sent to me for the purpose of making a video upon its release. However, no money was exchanged hands, etc., yada yada yada. My initial reaction upon hearing that this board was coming out was excitement, because the form factor of a Zero is a lot more conducive to putting it inside a project enclosure compared to a full-size Raspberry Pi B or B+ form factor. It's the same I/O as the original Pi Zero as well. It's got mini HDMI, micro USB for power, and peripheral SD card on top, and of course the 40-pin GPIO header too. Some will say USB-C, all the things. Some will say about the Pi 4, it has micro HDMI. Why is it still mini HDMI? I don't personally know. I actually kind of like that it's the same, because that means if you had a case for a Pi Zero, it's going to work on the Pi Zero 2. So I like that. I don't know that we need to always reinvent the wheel for board layout. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. I also have a lot of micro USB power supplies that are 5-volt 2-amp, ideal for a Pi. So that's convenient, for me at least. It has the same CPU architecture that was on the original Pi Zero, but with 4 cores instead of just 1. This means it's the same CPU that you'll find on a Pi 3 A+, B, and B+. It still only has 512 megabytes of RAM, that's half a gigabyte, but that puts it in the same spec basically as the Pi 3 A+, although with a slightly lower base clock speed. Now, that all sounds lovely on paper, but this is the Blitz City DIY channel, not the fancy show and tell influencer unboxing channel. So we've got to run some tests. We've got to see how this is actually working. The tests were run using Phoronix for the most part. Phoronix is an open source benchmarking toolkit that I've used a lot. I highly recommend it. I ran tests on the Pi Zero 2, of course, but I also ran them on the original Pi Zero, the Pi 3 A+, the Pi 3B, and the Pi 4. Pi 4 mainly for control, so you could see like the maximum performance you can get out of a Pi right now and just kind of compare across all the specs. The main goal of these tests is really to see how the Pi Zero 2, of course, compares to the original Pi Zero, but more interesting, I think, will be how does it compare to the Pi 3 A+ and Pi 3B, since it's so close in spec, especially to the A+, since it has the same amount of RAM. I did not test against a Pi 3B+ because it has a higher clock speed to the other Pi 3s, so it would have been a little redundant. It's really about comparing those 3 boards. So we begin with ENCODE FLAC, a single core benchmark, with everything performing basically as expected. The Zero 2 is better than the Zero, but slightly less than the 3 A+ and B. And a bit of a spoiler, but not really, the Pi 4 will be winning in all categories. Again, it's just for control purposes to ground the data. Next is Himeno, a multi-core benchmark, and the Zero 2 was right in line with the 3 A+ and 3B, which was nice to see. This was followed by Git, and again, the Zero 2 is best friends with the 3 A+ and 3B. The poor original Zero, though, it was actually pretty tough to run some of these tests on it just because of how much time it took. Nevertheless, though, it persisted, and the test did run. PyBench is a Python benchmark, and we've got more of the same spread. The FFmpeg test had great results for the Zero 2. I wasn't sure with just half a gig of RAM and slower clock speed, but it held its own, especially compared to the original Zero, which I actually had to let run overnight. And that was it for the Phoronix tests that I ran. I didn't do my full deep dive that I've done in the past with the testing because a lot of those tests just don't run very well on a single board computer. So you're not really getting great information. Those 5 tests I find are the most high yield and run the most reliably. They give you the best idea of how these boards are really performing. I rounded things out by calculating pi to the 1,000th and 10,000th decimal. Again, similar spread for the 1,000, and just to note, that is seconds that we're measuring on the y-axis. For 10,000, it is minutes, and the 02 was a minute or two slower than the pi 3s, but still quite the improvement over the original pi 0, our tired but hearty board. And that test is just run in the terminal using a quick little script. Anecdotally, although not any real-world testing, I will say that the 02 seemed to remain really stable and fairly cool when running at full load, which was nice to see because I think with its form factor, it's destined for embedded projects that would have it never seeing the light of day again, and as a result, fresh air. And speaking of projects, I want to see if I could get Blinka, the CircuitPython compatibility layer for Linux, running on the Pi 02. And I kind of did. I was able to get the board to be recognized. It took a bit of noodling, but the secret for getting it to be identified in Blinka was the CPU revision code. I found that added to the board.py file. I was in business there. There's like 5 people that understood what I just said, and hello to all 5 of you. And then I was able to run a test script with Blinka, and that confirmed it saw I2C, SPI, and the digital I/O. I didn't get too much further because I wanted to do some stuff with NeoPixels and the pillow library, but it wasn't quite there. And between time constraints and the fact that this board isn't totally out yet, so I couldn't really ask for help, I kind of stopped there. But yeah, for me, that's where I see using this board, using Blinka, doing some more kind of Raspberry Pi based CircuitPython projects. For the purpose of doing projects, I did solder a color-coded header to the top because all headers should be color-coded. Counting header spaces, you're bound to make some sort of error. Color-coded headers, it's the way to go. So this board, the Pi 02, it's going to be retailing for $15 USD. And compared to the Pi 3A Plus at $25 and the Pi 3B at $35, and the performance comparison, I see that as tracking fairly decently. But of course, as always with Pi, you can't just take that base price and call it a day. You need to factor in that you need accessories, and in this case, adapters. And so it's not actually that cost. It's the upfront, and then there hasn't been this kind of Linux performance before, from Raspberry Pi at least, in this form factor. So I'm excited to do some projects that I hadn't necessarily pursued before, specifically because of sizing considerations. Putting a full-size Pi inside of an enclosure can be a bit cumbersome, and also considering the price of that board and the amount of hardware on it, I always cringe a little bit. And so I always kind of evaluate, can this be accomplished with a smaller microcontroller with a slightly different approach? You're just not going to have Linux on it. And if that's the case, then I would go in that direction. But now with the 02, that consideration has changed for folks. So the landscape of projects might also change a bit. If I had one complaint, it would be, I wish it had 1 GB of RAM rather than the half gig. Half gig feels a bit lacking. I mean, as you saw, it performed basically the same as the Pi 3A Plus, which also has half a gig of RAM, and Pi 3B, which does have a full gig of RAM. So I mean, the 4 cores and the 1 gigahertz clock speed, it's going to get you to where you need to go. After using a Pi 4, getting used to so much RAM, then going back to this and using, a web browser with 1 or 2 tabs open, you notice it. So 1 gig of RAM would have been nice. But that's the Raspberry Pi 02 single board computer. I'm excited to do some projects with it. I have one specifically in mind that would involve Blinka and NeoPixel and the Pillow graphics library. But until then, this has been Blitz City DIY.